Ta-da! Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining again for another episode of What the Hell Is He Talking About? So this is Barry with Sedona Wine and Vortex Tours, and I'm here to hopefully confuse you really big time with my psychotic ramblings about vortexes and Sedona and all that. So anyway, I tend to speak a little extemporaneously. I don't have a script or a, what the hell you call it, teleprompter. I like the long form format for doing video work. I like it to be a little nuanced and not so rigid and, like I'm reading a script, So anyways, I'm trying to do a series here and, break it up in parts so it's not like just endlessly long videos. The first one I did was, are the vortexes real? Part 1. I don't know if I want to break it up into numbered parts, but more like standalone kind of videos where, you can get into the topic or subject matter and you can kind of skip around. You don't have to go in order. But in the last video, I did address the topic, are the vortexes real? And, I probably confused the hell out of you with that because, I end by saying yes, maybe, and definitely no, and all that. But in the middle of all that, even though I kind of break down the whole supposed science of the vortexes and then kind of give you the real science as far as I see it, there is kind of a caveat and a disclaimer that as much as I kind of dismiss the whole vortex foo-foo, that's not to say that there's not something real and powerful going on in Sedona. I can't fully explain it, but it does appear to be metaphysical in nature. But let's break that down a little bit because here's kind of the substance of my tours. And I do scenic tours, wine tasting, vortex tours. I'm definitely more driven and more focused on the whole vortex aspect of my tours because it's the most meaningful. It's where I have the most opportunity to help people find or guide them to some kind of event or experience it's going to be life-changing and fulfilling and very meaningful to them. So, and that really, is what I kind of get off on, not to be crass, but I think it's really cool. And I'm going to share some of those stories with you. But right now, I kind of want to get into the whole Prana viewing thing, how I came to it, where it's gone, how it's developed, and how I think, I guess, and to be humble, how I've found enlightenment and how you can too, and how I'm going to share that with you. Excuse me, my nose itches. It's allergy season, but anyways, I'm not trying to start or become this central figure in any kind of a cult or anything like that. I would like to grow this as an enterprise, and like Buddha said, everyone has the right to correct livelihood, or something like that. So I think out of all the things I can do and the things that I have done, this is probably the most correct. And maybe the reason for that is because it kind of helps me as I do it. And I definitely need help. I'm a, severely dysfunctional, messed up person. If you understood my gene pool, then that would make sense, but I'm definitely not going to get into all that. Rachel, if you're listening to this, that's, Claudia, anyway. So, I'll just start with, I had never heard of Sedona or Vortex. It's kind of a long story, so I'm going to try to keep it a little more on the abbreviated side, but, a friend of mine gave me a book. Him and I shared a really strong interest in paranormal and metaphysical phenomenon. So the book was called Sedona Psychic Energy Vortexes by an author named Dick Sutphin, who owned Valley of the Sun Publishing Company. Now, Valley of the Sun, I think, was seated in Malibu or Agoura Hills, California, but Dick Sutphin lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. So he used to come up to Sedona a lot, and he did seminars. And, back in the day, he was always at Enchantment Resort when he would come up for his seminars. People would come in from all over North America or wherever to stay there or stay in Sedona and go to the conference center and do this psychic seminars or past life regression. That was a big thing of his. But anyways, now there's some what are often referred to as coincidences built into this story, which are maybe not coincidences at all. But I was out of the military, living back up in Northern California, had my business there. I was not that far from my hometown. And I used to go up there sometimes on the weekends to do a variety of things. A lot of times just a party. Other times to help a friend build a fence or a corral on their ranch, or visit family, whatever. But my family moved to that area of Northern California at this same year that another family did. We came from Southern California. They came from like the Sacramento Valley. So they bought a property up in the mountains. We bought a property down in the valley. I was one of two sons, and then there was my mother and my, I think, stepdad number 7. And then in their family, it was mom and dad and their 2 children. So the families, my parents met their parents by coincidence at the hardware store or something. And they just hit it off. And we all became really good friends. And we found out as time went along that between our 2 families, there were a lot of coincidental birthdays. So my mother and my stepdad were both born the same day in January 7th, as well as the father in the other family. And then the wife, mother in the other family, was born Christmas Day, as was my brother. And then the son of the other family, who was younger than me, kind of became like a little brother to me. He was born January 4th, and I was born January 4th. So really weird kind of coincidence there. But anyways, we ended up hitting it off, and we spent a lot of time at each other's properties, having cookouts, and, again, partying a little bit or working on stuff, cars, vehicles, ranch stuff. And so over time, we just became really bonded. But it was also that his name was Frank. Frank and I, the father, shared a really strong interest in paranormal and metaphysical phenomenon. So by the time I had gotten back up in that area after the military, the families had kind of scattered. The wives went down to the cities to work. The kids went off to school or got jobs or whatever. My brother, moved to a different town. I went in the military and stuff, but, came back, and it was just really the men on the respective properties. And so, I used to go up there a lot and spend time, and, because Frank and I had a really strong interest in metaphysical and paranormal phenomenon. So I went up there one time. He had this book on his table, SEDONA'S Psychic Energy Vortexes, and it was a crazy cover you'll see here, but it just drew me immediately. I was really curious to it, so picked it up. On the cover, it had a picture of a Native American shaman woman. Now, I had gotten to know Dick Sutphin, and I had later actually gotten to know this woman that was on the cover of this book. And her name was Susie Yazzie, and she was a, kind of a world famous Navajo woman who was a jewelry maker, rug weaver, an elder in the tribe, and also regarded somewhat as kind of a shaman. So she was on the cover of this book. I didn't know her then, of course, but I picked it up and I'm like, wow, light beams shooting out of her face and all this, but just really intense book covers. So I said, "What's a Sedona?" And my friend Frank, he said, "Well, that's a town in Arizona." And I said, "Okay, cool. What the hell's a vortex?" So he had already read the book. And he started explaining this to me, and we kind of got deep into that subject. But he could tell I was really passionate about it, and he's very free about giving away books that he's already read. So he said, "Hey, take it, it's yours." So I was like, "Yeah, cool." So I took it home and I read the whole thing cover to cover, and that's when I started really, get into it. It had a lot of subject matter in it that really massaged or tickled, things that I was really interested in metaphysically and in the paranormal category. Like people that had come to Sedona and went to a vortex and had these psychic experiences, which I think I remember having a lot of those like when I was younger. I mean, really powerful, intense stuff. But also people that said they came here and they went to a vortex and met aliens and, got to ride on their spaceship and took them, around the universe and showed them their home planet. And of course they always, forget their camera. They never get pictures of this. But anyways, then brought them back to the vortex, dropped them off and said, "Hey, thanks for coming." So, and I, being 35 some odd years younger than I am now, that was like, wow. I mean, when you get older, you start to filter things a little better. Back then, I was a little more open to extreme possibility. I still am, but you start to kind of filter things out through discernment, as you mature. And, that has definitely happened. But back then, I was like, wow, UFOs and Sedona, wow, we got to go, So I went back to my friend and I said, we got to do a road trip out there. And he was kind of agreeable to that. And we talked about it. Likely would have never done it. And then at some point it became kind of moot because he got a brain tumor and passed away. So that was a really dramatic ordeal. And it was very sad and tragic. But the truth is that if he hadn't passed, I never would have come to Sedona to make the discoveries and find the path that I have been on. So after he had passed, my father knew what was going on, and he called me, and he was sensing that I needed some time away. So the fact that I had my own business made it easy for me to just block time out, leave town. So he said, "Hey, I'm buying another car." And he knew that all I had to drive was my van that I ran my business with, but not a great daily driver. So he said, the car I have, I don't want to trade in because they're probably going to rip me off. I'd rather you have it. It's a good little economy car. So he was going to fly me back to Oklahoma and give me the car, and I'm down with that, because I did need time away. Had to decompress. So just lost one of my best friends. So anyway, he flew me back there and we visited, and I had the car, and I'm driving back cross country toward California. Interstate 40, long stretch of interstate that runs kind of in the middle of the country, but passes through all these states. And then coming into Arizona, this is long before, like back in 1990 or something. We didn't have maps or apps or internet or phones or, any of that stuff. So you drove and you got around by, navigating with a atlas. And that's what I had. I always kept a trucker's atlas, large size Rand McNally road map in the car. So I had that stretched across my steering wheel, and I'm driving down the, long straight stretch of interstate, and I'm coming into Arizona and I see Flagstaff. I'm half thinking I might stop there. And, wow, I noticed Sedona's I knew Sedona was in Arizona. Didn't know where, but I knew it was in Arizona. It's just when I looked at Flagstaff, boom, it jumped off the map at me because it was only 30 miles south, So I told myself there's absolutely no possible way that I'm going to pass that close to Sedona and not go. So I stopped in Flagstaff and I got a room. Came down here the next morning to Sedona through Oak Creek Canyon, which is absolutely beautiful. One of the 3 most beautiful scenic drives in the United States, according to National Geographic. at least, at one point. So, but I ended up in Uptown Sedona because that's where 89A kind of leads you to. So now Uptown was quite a bit different then than it is now. A lot of things have changed, but there's a very famous restaurant there. You can see a link to it on my website, but it's called the Cowboy Club. And that started out, I think, as a watering hole for local ranchers and farmers. But a lot of cowboy movie stars went there because they were here making movies and, doing, horse shit and, whatever. But anyway, that was like a local rancher cowboy watering hole. So, but then at that time, when I got here the first time, it was a hiking store. And I went in there and I just wanted to get some information. I wanted to get some water, kind of, anything else I might need for the day because I was going to be outdoors. I didn't know really anything. I didn't have the book with me, Dick Sutphen's book, because I wasn't planning on being here. I had no instructions. I had no, idea where these vortexes were. So I went in there to maybe find out and get some things that I needed. So I met this really cute hippie girl in there, and she was very friendly. And she was the first time I realized when I met her that girls with hairy legs and nose rings could be kind of hot. So, fell deeply in like with her for the few minutes we, spent together. But really, really nice girl, just cute, had a lot of, appeal. So I asked her about the vortexes, and I said, how do you get there? What do you do? So she said, well, we got a free map that we have over at the counter. So I followed her over to the retail counter, and she pulled out the map, and she's showing me and kind of orienting me around Sedona and where the vortex sites are, and she's circling them with a pen. And so then I had the inspiration to ask her, well, what's your favorite vortex? So she said, well, I really favor Bell Rock because it was relatively easy to get to compared to like Cathedral Rock or Boynton Canyon. And, she told me there's lots of trails. She could walk her dog, sit there and, meditate and contemplate, her navel and the mysteries of the universe and whatever. And so as she was describing it to me, I started getting this real distinct feeling that that's where I was supposed to go. So I said, okay, she showed me the other ones, but I was kind of like going, Bell Rock sounds pretty good. So, but, I still didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. So I left, said thanks, grabbed my stuff, and I drove down to Bell Rock. And back then there were no big, huge paved parking areas that held like hundreds of cars. It was a little wide dirt spot off the side of the road, where you could maybe fit 10 cars. And the day I went there, it was a beautiful, clear, sunny day. I forget what month, but it seemed like it should have been busy season. There were only 3 cars there. So I was like maybe the 4th one, and it was like almost nobody there. Now it's like packed. So I grabbed my water, and I just kind of figured out kind of where the trail was and decided I was going to go up about halfway up the rock and find a nice, cool, shady spot to kind of kick it and drink my water. And so I found a nice, comfortable spot, and I just sat there and I leaned against the rock, and I'm taking in the view, really beautiful panoramic Sedona Red Rock view for the first time. And I'm going, wow, man, my spirit was just like going, wow, and opening up and all that. And I was kind of cooling down and stuff. So then I decided, well, I'm just going to sit here, close my eyes, focus on my breathing, and wait for something vortexy to happen, or like a British guy told me, vortexical, and just wait for something to happen. I didn't care what it was. It could have been psychic, impressions. It could have been past life, stuff. It could have been, maybe sensations coming out of the ground that I read about. It could have been UFOs. I didn't care. I just wanted some validation that everything I had thought about, this big, huge, mysterious universe that we live in, that there was much more beyond, what we experience in our day-to-day lives. And I just wanted confirmation and validation that, there was something there, that it was true, that, So I closed my eyes and I started breathing, and nothing was happening. So I wanted to be very, diligent about this and patient because it came a long way. And I wanted to give it the, respect that it deserved. So, I just decided to be patient. I'm more about instant gratification, but, I was willing to just suspend that. So, but I sat there with my eyes closed and I focused on my breathing for what seemed like probably a half hour, 45 minutes. And nothing was happening. I wasn't feeling anything. There were no aliens. There was no, vibration or heat or anything. And so I started to get a little impatient, and I was starting to say, well, this is a bunch of hype, chalking it up to just BS to sell books and tours and, whatever else. And so I opened my eyes, and that's when things changed very dramatically. So as I was looking out and kind of toward the sky, suddenly my entire field of view was filled with these little tiny flashing lights that were swimming around and kind of flashing on and off. And my first instinct, honestly, was panic. When I first saw this, I had no idea what it, was not in the book. And I, didn't understand it. And I thought maybe I'm having a medical event, which didn't make any sense because I was fit as a horse back then. But, it was just scary to me. And I didn't know, am I having a stroke or, what's going on? So I was just like, and I tried closing my eyes and shaking it off. And every time I opened my eyes, boom, it was just there. But I mean, the sky was densely filled with these lights everywhere I looked, horizon to horizon, everywhere I looked and panned across, and so I was a little terrified actually. So I started to actually get up from my spot to leave and maybe go find a hospital. And my inner voice kicked in and spoke to me very strongly. And it said, shh, be quiet, settle down, don't be stupid. Maybe this is what you're supposed to see. And I could hear it speaking to me like, an adult, gentle voice trying to calm a child who was upset. And so I'm like, okay, I wasn't in any pain. I wasn't disoriented, nothing like that. So I decided to just kind of relax back into where I was sitting and just kind of take this in. And it was an amazing light show. It was vivid and brilliant and sharp and clear, and it was just unmistakable to me. So I continued to observe this phenomenon for maybe an hour or so. I'm just guessing, but it seemed like I couldn't really get enough of it once I got comfortable with it. But then I got the message that it was time to go. I had got what I came for. And, I would kind of call this like a vortex experience on steroids. And so this is before I really understood the vortex thing and how I have come to regard it now. But back then I was willing to believe in, the energy maybe coming out of the rock and all that. But this is unrelated to that. But it brought me there, the notion, the sociological notion of the existence of vortexes has brought so many people there, including myself, that with all the coincidental elements that stacked up to bring me there from California under the circumstances that I was there, I mean, it was mind-blowing. So I left. I started to hike back down, and that's when the phenomenon started to go away. So I drove home to California, and this experience just stayed with me pretty much all the way back. And when I got home, I had to kind of get settled back into real life. I had to, eventually get involved in running my business again. The Sedona experience kind of took the back burner, and I just, was kind of always there in the background, but everything started to change. My whole life started to go completely upside down. This absolutely nasty war broke out between me and my landlady's criminal ex-felon sons. Both of them were, adults in their 40s that had violent criminal histories and had just been released from prison. But the older one used to live in my cottage, which was right next door to my landlady, and he wanted it back. He wanted, so he undertook a harassment effort that was ongoing to get me out of there so he could, because he was living with mommy again. And he didn't, they were driving each other nuts. So he wanted the cottage and, was doing his best to drive me out of there. So anyway, that went on for a while, but I'd also, took about a year for me to get everything done and ready to leave. So, I sold my business. I got my household goods put in storage. And the night before I left, I literally did not know where I was going. And so my late friend Frank's wife, Frank's the one that gave me the book, but her name was Joni. Her and I were really close friends too, but we're on the phone talking, and she said, well, where are you going? And I said, Joni, I really don't know. I couldn't go any further west because I'm already, right close to the ocean. Going east, half thinking about maybe Colorado. And so she said, you know where you're going. Don't be silly. She goes, just think about it. And so there was a pause in our conversation. So she had always wanted to come to Sedona, never got to. And she's gone now too. Just about everybody's gone now. So, but anyways, she said, you know where you're going. Just think about it. And there was a pause in the conversation. So the word Sedona popped in my mind. And I said, Sedona? And she goes, you're going to Sedona. And I didn't immediately have any reason why I shouldn't come to Sedona. So I thought about it. I'm like, well, I'd already been here. I liked it. Met a cute hippie girl. I had a really powerful Vortex experience, and there was no reason not to come to Sedona. So I said, okay, well, I guess I'm going to Sedona. And so we finished our conversation, and the next morning, me and my cat that I had at the time, Wolfgang, we left California, never looked back. So I got here about 1991, started driving Jeeps immediately. That was like the cool job to have. So, and it looked really fun. Well, it took me a while to break into it. New guy, you got to like kind of beat the door a little bit, get some attention. But I eventually got hired as a Jeep tour driver. And so that's how I kind of cut my teeth in the tour industry in Sedona. But I noticed that like all the companies like do some version of a Vortex tour. I didn't immediately, try to get into that at all. For some reason, I had an aversion to it. But I don't know if it was just too much of a spiritual thing for me. But, I drove for a few different companies, then ended up working for one. I won't say their name. But they asked me if I wanted to do Vortex tours. And I said, well, I'm not sure. So they said, okay, well, you want to train a little bit? And I'm like, sure. So in my previous video, that's what I kind of mentioned, that whole episode where it gets into a very much of a gaslighting thing. It's entertainment. It's not a serious spiritual, immersive kind of experience. And so, often what they do is they take you by some place that they call a Vortex site, or maybe an actual one if it's accessible. A couple of them are. But, it's just kind of this routine. It maybe lasts 10 minutes, and they may have like, anywhere from, 2 to maybe 15 people with them. And they just kind of run through this routine and, blah, blah, blah. And then boom, it's over. And it's like, oh, let's check out this agave, show them a twisted tree and say, oh, the Vortex did that, bullshit. But anyways, sorry, I had a tickle in my throat. But anyways, I didn't want to do that. So, but I did notice when I came back to Sedona that I could still see the little lights. I didn't know what to call them at the time. I had no idea what this was. But Sedona was an easy place to make friends then. We had a really small, tight-knit community, and it was kind of like family. And you know how it is. You got, family you like and family you definitely don't like. But what made us family is that, most of the people I met in my peer group and beyond, outside that a little bit, we all felt like we had some purpose in being here. Like we had, either were brought here or born here, and we, kind of had some purpose with Sedona. So that was common, and that's what made Sedona a really awesome, fun, beautiful, colorful community at one point. You wouldn't believe what was here then. I mean, it was just beyond imagination, and it's not here anymore. And I was so fortunate that I got to be a part of it when it was still really vibrant and alive, and all these crazy things were happening here. But one of the friends I made, his name's Ryan Hunter. I usually don't want to give names, but Ryan was a fairly famous actor at one point. Did a lot of television and movies and a lot of stuff that kind of went straight to video. Probably more television than anything. But he had discovered Sedona like years before I did, when he was out here doing film work, and fell in love with the place. And when he got back to LA, he wanted to get his new wife and newborn child out of LA. They're old friends of mine. At the time, the daughter was a newborn. When I met her, she was, was she a toddler? She might have been a toddler, but anyway, she's a fully grown adult now. But anyway, I knew the whole family pretty well. But definitely, had more of a bond with Ryan. He's still a really good old friend of mine. But he started like a shamanic, spiritual kind of tour company. I don't want to call them tours. They were more like journeys is what he did. But he took people out into the Red Rocks and tried to walk them on an enlightenment path and educate them and teach them about spirituality. So, really deep, probably the most spiritual person I've ever known. So I caught him, but I didn't know him extremely well at this point. I was still kind of new in town, but was finding all the cool hangout spots. I'm much more about the coffee houses than I am about the breweries and the bars. So I ran into him at the coffee house, and I was thinking about it, and I sat down with him and I said, hey Ryan, I'm wondering if maybe you can help me figure something out here. And he's like, sure. What is it? So I told him my story and my experience, and described to him the phenomena that I had seen. I said, what do you think that was? And he goes, well, I'm not sure. I've never seen anything like that myself, but it sounds to me like what you're describing is something called Prana. And I'm like, Prana? Wow, what is that? So Prana, he told me, is an ancient Sanskrit word that comes from the Hindu tradition, and it means life force energy. And I'm like, what? Life force energy? I mean, he wasn't telling me for sure, but I had to consider that that's what I had seen, because I had never heard of this before. I asked this question of, a very wise man who informed me that it could be this, and I'm going, wow, that's kind of like being Moses and going up to the mountain and seeing the burning bush, it was like, I didn't know what to think, but it was like, whoa, that's kind of overwhelming to me. Excuse me while I take a sip of my iced coffee. But anyways, okay, so we finished our conversation, and I started to look this up every time I was near a bookstore or library. What is Prana? It's definitely this Hindu thing, and I'm not a Hindu, never became a Hindu. But I did learn that the Hindus have nailed some spiritual principles pretty well. So that's really clear. When you get into their archetypal systems and their pantheon and their philosophy and stuff, there's some pretty good stuff there. So But anyways, at some point, years after that conversation, it kind of faded from my priorities. I was caught up in, day-to-day survival and mountain biking and drumming circles and hanging out at the coffee house or the brewery. I didn't drink a lot, but that's kind of where everybody went when it opened. So, I had to go there to find my friends, my social milieu. But I ended up working at a hiking store in West Sedona and was good friends with the owners. They, really liked me, and was, like almost best buddies with one of the guys that worked there, very experienced, expert mountaineer and rock climber guy. Him and I ran a tour company together for a while. But before that, they invited me to come in and actually work there. So I'm like, I've never tried retail before. I discovered that I suck at it, because it's not really interesting to me. But anyway, I thought I'd give it a try. And, while I was there, I got to kind of see how retail environment works. I got to see, how merchandise comes in and gets inventoried and put out for sale. And so, we were receiving new shipments of merchandise all the time and stocked it in the store. A lot of stuff you're probably familiar with, like Columbia, Patagonia, North Face, etc. Well, there was a new brand, new company, new factory, high-end kind of rock climbing gear, hiking gear, clothing, yoga stuff. And I didn't know what it was. I came in early one day because the merchandise had showed up the day before, still in the boxes. And, I came in at like 9 a.m. to unpack it, inventory it, get it out on the racks ready for sale, and then open the store at 10 o'clock. So, showed up with a coffee in my hand and nobody was there. I opened the door. I went in. I was alone. I turned on some really good music. I think I got to hang out with a girlfriend the night before, so I was kind of walking on a cloud, just in a good mood, and so I started cutting into the boxes, opening the tops of them. Didn't know what I was going to find, but I started pulling out clothing. And the tags on the clothing looked like this. So, Prana Clothing Company. And I froze in my tracks and I had to grab the clothing rack next to where I was standing to kind of steady myself. Because when I have a heavy duty, impactful psychic event like this, it destabilizes me physically. I get a little lightheaded. I, kind of get swimmy and, but this hit me like a ton of bricks. It was like, boom, the universe just saying, hey, check this out. And so I'm like, okay. And the word prana that you see there, it was kind of intended, according to this experience, as a flashing banner to get my immediate attention, which it did. Because the more I looked at the image, the more it became apparent to me that there was something hidden there. I hadn't quite seen it yet, but the longer I looked at it, the more I was figuring it out. And all of a sudden, boom. The little squiggly lines that you see above the word prana are a depiction of the phenomenon that I saw. And so now to qualify that a little bit, you see these big squiggly lines, not to be crass, they look like sperm cells, okay? Are representative of the phenomenon. But I think the imagery comes from ancient Hindu art or literature or something that the artist who designed that logo probably did some research, looked some things up, and decided to incorporate that into the business logo. Typically prana is not regarded as a visible phenomenon. But maybe it is. Maybe, the Hindus and the yogis and the Vedics had to be referring to something. And so maybe that shows up in ancient Hindu artwork somewhere that I have not seen, and then found its way into this logo. But the actual prana, if that's what they are, and I can't prove that they are, appear similar to that squiggly line in that you have kind of a luminous nucleus, like a dot in the center of an auric field or energetic field, I don't know what to call it, that surrounds that nucleus, but as it moves, it leaves this wispy little tail. And it tends to look like a little sperm cell under a microscope swimming around, but they flash on and off. And so it just leveled me. All of a sudden I realized that there's something really real and powerful going on here. That's what I mean about, when I refer to the Sedona vortex as a sociological thing, you can see prana anywhere almost, and I'll qualify that at some point, but I was brought to Sedona to see it. Not because the vortexes generate it, but the notion that Sedona is the spiritual center brings so many people here, including me, that maybe a percentage of us, have some kind of real experience that's not connected to any foo-foo fake, vortex energy that's supposed to come out of the ground, but just the fact that, other people come here to have a spiritual, metaphysical experience. So, excuse me, I'm going to make a technical adjustment. My beautiful studio lights are running out of batteries, so I'm going to plug them in and boom, be right back. Okay, so anyways, again, this long string of very powerful, quote, coincidences, which some people say there are no coincidences, right? Very clearly and apparently brought me to this point. So I didn't know the future, didn't know what my purpose ultimately was going to be with this, but I got here somehow. And it seems like the whole concept of the prana is becoming, a very important part of my life. So I'm just kind of going where I'm led. And often we're led places where we should go, and we struggle with that, and we avoid that, and we resist it, and we end up in other places where we probably should not go. With regard to my dating life, I can certainly tell you that that's true. So, but anyways, I had found that, once I had become familiar with the notion that the phenomena that I see is called prana, that's what I started kind of calling it. So, but again, when I came back to Sedona, I discovered that I could still see it, and I didn't have to be at a vortex to do that. And then I've seen it other places outside of Sedona, but again, I'll qualify that a little bit. But I also learned that I could show it to other people. And so one time I was out with a girlfriend. We were on a little road trip out of town, Flagstaff, and we ended up in a beautiful prairie meadow kind of near the base of San Francisco Mountain. And, we drink a little wine and just kind of cruising on a dirt road. And we decided that we were going to just park and lay down in this grassy field and stare up at the sky. So I started seeing the prana like really heavy. And I asked her, do you want to see something cool? And because she wasn't seeing it. But I showed her how to kind of adjust her focus. And then all of a sudden, whoa! I mean, she reacted, and it was almost scary in a way, but it was also, but it was scary because it wasn't frightening. It was powerful, and I was just like, wasn't expecting, that much of a reaction, but she saw it, and she just like, oh my God, So we stared at this for like a long time. So I'd learned that, but it had never occurred to me ever to like try to incorporate this experience as some kind of a tour. Probably because the time wasn't right. I didn't understand it enough. I wasn't on a path where I maybe even could have understood it. But moving forward a little bit, I lived in Thailand for a couple of years. I was happy there, trying to, I wanted to leave Sedona because I'd been here so long. And, the world's a pretty big place. I wanted to see more of it. But I had a girlfriend there, and we lived there together for a couple of years, and it was just wonderful, But in 2014, there was a military coup in Thailand, and the military took over in Bangkok. I mean, they just kind of cleared the streets. Long story, but there was like kind of a political civil war that was developing. And the military used that as an excuse to take over the entire government. So they did. And I actually lived through that. And I lived under martial law for a period of time. And that was kind of weird. But my plans started to kind of go to hell. And I had to come back to the United States. And the only place I could come back to really was Sedona. Because there's always been a network here that has supported me. So when I came back, it was easy for me to find things to do. So I did that. And I started driving Uber for a while. And that went pretty well. And, I had a really nice SUV. And so my Uber passengers started asking me, hey, do you do tours? And I'm like, yeah, well, sure. Why not? I mean, duh. Why didn't I think of that with all the tour, years of tour experience I had? Of course I do tours. So I started doing tours for, because most of my Uber passengers were people who were in Sedona looking to have a good time, looking for interesting things to do. So when they started asking about doing tours, I had cards printed, and everybody that got in my car, I started handing cards out, and I started doing a bunch of tours on the side. That became kind of my side hustle. And then, but it was doing well. And so I did scenic tours. Dabbled in wine tours a little bit. But then one time I picked up a family of 5 adults in the village of Oak Creek. They were at the Hilton. And I was taking them into Sedona for their dinner appointment. And just as we were passing Bell Rock, one of them asked me, hey, do you do Vortex tours? And I'm like, I was kind of stumped by that. I was like, kind of avoided doing that. But I thought about it, and I looked at Bell Rock, and I remembered my experience with the Prana. I said, maybe. I said, we could try something. I said, I'll tell you what I can maybe do, but let's don't make it a Vortex tour. Let's make it a scenic tour. We'll go by the Vortex, and I'll show you this thing called Prana, or what I know of as Prana. And, maybe that'll do it for you, but I don't want to set you up for some big disappointment. So they said, yeah, well, that sounds reasonable. So I think it was the next day I picked them up at the Hilton, and I said, okay, so not knowing what else to do, I just said, let's go to Bell Rock. So we, illegally went to Bell Rock and parked, and we just walked up the trail a little bit and we didn't go up high on the mountain at all. We just found a trail and, kind of planted our asses under the shade of a juniper tree. And I said, okay, so just look up and, kind of adjust your focus this way and start to look for the little sparkles, And so they're like, oh my, all 5 of them just lit up. They were like, oh my God, they're everywhere. And I had to make sure they were seeing what I wanted them to see. And it seemed really clear that they did. But there's other things, that you want to make sure that they can kind of distinguish from. Floaters being one of them. Other stuff I'll get into. But anyways, they weren't seeing floaters. They were seeing, exactly what I had described to them. All 5 of them. And they're like, oh my God. So they were actually very blown away. I mean, everybody has kind of the same reaction when they first see it. It's just like this mind-blowing kind of experience. And so I didn't know what else to say about it. It's just, I think that's called Prana. And so we got back to the car, and they all got in, and I started the vehicle, and they said, wow, that was really amazing. I said, okay, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I guess I do Vortex tours now, So they're like, well, you should, So I took that as a nudge that I needed to do this. So I started to add that to my repertoire and, list of kind of tour points of interest. So, and more people started to ask. So I started to introduce more people to the phenomenon. Then I started to dabble in wine tours a little bit, and then I eventually came up with the idea of Sedona Wine and Vortex tours. And my slogan was Vineyards and Vortexes, right? So I don't want to characterize this the wrong way, but there's really no right way. So I'm being copied now, and that's okay. I guess imitation's a sincere form of flattery, but people are starting to kind of, I found my niche, and other people are trying to, squeeze into that niche, but nobody does what I do. So, take that for what it's worth. So anyways, I started doing Vortex tours, and, it started out just me taking people to a place and showing them the Prana, not really knowing, how to define it for them. But over time, I started, being able to do that a little bit more and a little bit more. But then one time I was contacted by a young lady who owns a regional travel website. And she wanted to sell me advertising. And so she told me about her program. We spoke on the phone. It started out with the email, but we spoke on the phone. And she ended up kind of giving me her pricing. And I said, I'll think about it. Sounds kind of cool, but I don't know if I can really justify putting that kind of money into it. She said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll give you 60 days for free. And I said, really? Wow. Well, then I can definitely try it. So I said, sign me up. And so, she offered me the 2 months free advertising. And in return, I said, well, listen, kind of look through your website. It seems like you do a little editorializing there. And I said, I would like to offer you and some friends a free Vortex tour. And she goes, wow, that would be great. So she arranged it. We scheduled it. It was totally comped. And she came down with some friends. And we went to a place, I'm not going to say where, Bell Rock. And we found, again, a nice little spot on the ground under the shade of a juniper tree. And I got to tell you, be very careful, because baby cactus are sometimes just starting to come out of the ground. And you can't really see them unless you look for them. Don't just haphazardly sit down on the ground. You can sit on a rock, that's obvious, but where there's soil, you don't want to just plop down, because you can get an ass full of cactus. I haven't done it. People on my tour have, and it really sucks. So, it's only happened once or twice, but, you just really got to be careful there. Have something to sit on, or clear the ground, or find a spot where there's nothing there. So, anyways, it was me and her, and she had 3 friends. So, I introduced them to the concept of the Prana, at least what I knew about it at the time. I showed them how to see it. We're all sitting there. All of us start to see it. They're blown away. It's phenomenal. It's insane. It's wild. It's sick. It's, all this stuff, right? And so as they're sitting there kind of in awe of this, what appears to be a metaphysical experience, something they've just never seen before, and I'm sharing with them, my inner voice starts to speak to me again. And it says, put your hand into it. I didn't know what that meant immediately. I mean, it was almost too simple. I was trying to complicate it somehow. But I heard it again. It said, put your hand into it. And I'm like, what does that mean? So I'm like, and I just did this. I'm looking through my fingers. And all of a sudden, the prana start to bounce between my fingers. Almost like, I don't want to say Jacob's ladder, because it wasn't like, the laboratory. It was more like, and I almost said it, I was thinking it, but Chrissy, I'm sorry, the girl that, booked the tour, or that I offered the comp to, looked at me and she goes, "What are you doing?" Because I was like going, "Oh my God." And so I showed her, I said, "Put your hand up into the prana." And so she did, and she goes, "Oh my God, they're playing pong between my fingers." And that's what I was thinking. I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I see too." And they're just going, but there's a bunch of them in there, and they're all kind of bouncing back and forth, and they are clearly reacting to your body or something, that it appears that, they are reacting to your body and your hand's presence in the field of prana, whatever and wherever that is. They seem to know you're there, and they move around you, and they show you that they move within that constricted space between your fingers. So she starts just absolutely having a wild experience, and then her friends start doing it, and then all of a sudden we're all seeing it, and we're all blown away by it. And I told her, I said, "This is brand new. I've never seen this before." So it was a breakthrough. It was an advancement. It was new territory, but it opened up a whole bunch of questions about, what is this? Why is this happening? And, what is the nature of this? Which I just really couldn't get away from. But we had this experience, and by the time it was done, we were all very quiet going back to the car. And, when we got there, it's like I could tell everybody was thinking about this. It was still quiet, but it was like, what did I just see? So, it's funny how the experience has grown in spurts and steps and stages like that, because what happened next was sometime after that. I had another Vortex Prana viewing tour, and we went to a different spot, and I had some ladies with me, and there's a usual spot where I sit. We try to be in the shade. That really helps with contrast, but you don't have to be. And there's like a bunch of rocks behind me, and I'm talking about it. I'm showing and I'm introducing this phenomenon. And at some point in the process, one of the ladies sitting behind me says, "Oh, wow, this is pretty cool." Just very casually. I looked over my shoulder and I see her, and she goes, "Oh yeah, try this." And she's got her hand, instead of this, she's doing this. Got it in like a C shape. And she's looking through it like a monocular, And she goes, "Wow, they're like doing different things." And I'm like, "What?" I'm looking at her and I go, "Yeah, I guess I have to try that." So I put my hand up like this. I'm looking through, into the C shape. And I see the prana form in there, and they're moving around, they're bouncing around, but the pattern suddenly changes. Instead of bouncing back and forth between your fingers this way, they started moving around in circles and swirls and conforming to a round shape now, and going in and out of the space between my finger and thumb. And now I'm really, this really, what do they say, bake your noodle? Well, my noodle was being baked, because now I had to account for and try to explain or, discover why they change according to the shape of your hand when you hold your hand into the field of the prana. Why do they do that? And so that is where my revelations started to really happen. Because I had to consider that if this is a metaphysical experience, let's define metaphysical. So metaphysical means beyond physical. And then I realized we're in the physical world here, which is the third dimension, height, width, depth, right? So metaphysical has to be kind of anywhere outside of that realm. But, it was taking some real serious contemplative energy to try to figure out the dynamic here of what was happening. So then I realized it's like, wow, when you see your shadow or your reflection, we know that only has 2 dimensions. So suddenly it's like, okay, 3rd dimension. And then there's the 2nd dimension. And then, at some point I came into awareness that the 4th dimension is considered to be the spiritual dimension. And slowly over time, I started to put this together piece by piece. So if we experience the 2nd dimension, that's a metaphysical experience. And we do that every time we see our shadow or our reflection. And then I thought images on smartphones or television screens. Not the device, but the image you see. So if on the other side we have the 4th dimension, what's the mystery there? And as I started to look into 4th dimensional phenomenon, the whole topic of, physics and physical laws kind of came up. And in the physical world, we're governed by the laws of physics, but the metaphysical world is not. Metaphysical objects or extra-dimensional objects don't care about the laws of physics. So while 2 solid objects can't occupy the same space at the same time, an extra-dimensional object can. So with regard to like a 4th dimensional object, they don't obey the laws of physics. So theoretically, a 4th dimensional object can go through a 3-dimensional object or stop somewhere inside the same space at the same time. And that is what I believe our spirit does. When our spirit comes into this body, and I believe at the time we're born, it's looking for a human suit so it can have this human experience. How and why, I don't know. I try to keep this as religion neutral as possible. If we, believe in reincarnation, then, well, this is just the next house that we occupy for the period of time that we do. If we believe in, God, in the Christian sense, then maybe God said, to our spirit, I'm going to send you to earth. You're going to live this life as this person or this human. We'll see how you do at the end of it. Maybe you come up here or maybe you go down there. So maybe that's it. I don't know. But anyways, it just started to be clear to me that the reason the prana, my question was, why do they not pass through my hand or my fingers? Because you never see them like go through anything when you're holding your hand up or your fingers spread. They bounce away, or they do this or they come out. They never go through. So I had to wonder, it's like, okay, so if a 4th dimensional object could penetrate and pass through a 3-dimensional object, why does the prana not penetrate and pass through my hand? And then I can't say it was a definitive answer, but the possibility started to occur to me. Probably, or maybe, because my spirit is there in my hand. And then it occurred to me that maybe in the 4th dimension and others, there are laws and rules similar to what we have in the 3rd dimension. 4th dimensional object theoretically has 3 dimensions plus 1. So maybe there's rules that govern how they behave when they come into contact with each other. So when we're born, again, if we accept the notion that our spirit was looking for a human suit in order to live on this earth and walk through this world and have the experiences that it does, we have to consider the notion that everything we touch registers as part of that experience the spirit came here to have. So our spirit maybe fills out our entire body all the way to the extremities, the tips of my fingers, and then it's like, okay, so here I have a iPad stylus, right? And it's a mundane concept that I pick this up and I hold it and it activates nerves and cells and it sends signals to my brain, and that my eyes pick it up and sends more signals to my brain. And the realization is I'm holding a stylus in my hand or some other physical object. But then when we maybe hold someone we care about, or maybe we brush past someone and rub shoulders on a subway, and we get really creeped out by that. Maybe we know that person just gives us a really bad feeling. We don't know them, but that's real too. But beyond just touch, you have emotions, and you have, all these different levels of perception that can be activated by touching something. So your hand is an extension of your body and your spirit, and it all kind of concentrates as experience that we have in our mind, possibly in that little gland I mentioned earlier called the pineal gland, which could be the doorway or the nexus or the link point between our three-dimensional self and our fourth-dimensional self. And that every thought, emotion, and experience we have in this world is what we take back with us through the realm into the other side when we revert back to being purely spiritual beings. And the way it kind of works is this. So here in this diagram, I have a box and it has a 3 in it, and that's representative of the third dimension. To the immediate left of that, there's another box that has a 2 in it, and that is representative of the second dimension. And then to the immediate right of the 3, we have another box with a 4 in it, and that is representative of the fourth dimension. Okay? Simple. 2, 3, 4. Now, two-dimensional objects have 2 coordinates by which they can be measured. You have height and width, and that's it. So, as an experiment, go to a mirror, hold your hand up, keep it steady, and from where you're standing, if you change your perspective, the ratio is going to change. But if you hold it steady, you could take a tape measure or measuring device and hold it up, to the mirror where you see your hand, and you can ascertain a definite, distinct measurement of the width of your hand and the height of your hand from palm to fingertip. But then take that same measuring device and stab it into the mirror as hard as you want, but don't break it, and try to get a measurement of depth. And you will not be able to do that because it's not there. That dimension doesn't exist. Therefore, you are seeing a two-dimensional object because you are objectively realizing it in your mind as you see it. However, when you see your hand in the mirror, or you see my image in this video, you're having a metaphysical experience. It's not a particularly jazzy metaphysical experience because how do you make that spiritual, right? Well, it's there, trust me. But if you want to go directly to it, then we don't go to the second dimension. We go to the fourth dimension, which is right next door. Now, the fourth dimension is still very mysterious to us. Because one thing we have to remember, when we go from the lower dimensions to the higher dimensions, things get exponentially more complex. And that's what's represented in this diagram here. So when we go next door to the right, to the fourth dimension, we have to understand we're in a level of experience now that is exponentially more complicated than our physical experience. But it is considered by many philosophers, theologians, theosophists, scholars, researchers, that the fourth dimension is the spiritual dimension. I don't know how or why, but it does start to make sense as we go along here. It actually starts to make perfect sense. So if we take that as true, that the fourth dimension is the spiritual dimension, we can assume then that spiritual things reside there. Things that would be invisible to us normally, under most circumstances. So if I take a small rock, and this is what I do on my tours, and I throw it at a big rock, that small rock will bounce off and ricochet off the big rock. That is an example of the laws of physics in play where, two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time. So if I had a fourth dimensional rock in my hand and I threw it at the big three-dimensional rock, instead of bouncing off, it would go through, or would also be capable of stopping somewhere inside of the same time and the same space as the big rock. Okay? So if we accept the idea that we are embodied spirits, and if our bodies are three-dimensional, and if our spirit is fourth dimensional, then we have a body and we have a spirit. It's just automatically implied. But at some point, it seems to be the case that the spirit came into the same time and the same space as our body and put our body on as the human suit, the vessel, the instrument that our spirit is going to use to carry it through this life and this world and this experience. And again, that could be karma, that could be God's will, I don't know. We're just told to seek and find, so I've been seeking and I've been finding. This is what I've found. So I'm sharing it with you. But it will lead to a point where I'll show you your power in this, actually. And I have real world examples of this actually happening. So this video may get broken up into a few parts, but I'm just going to keep rolling while I have the inspiration. So if somewhere in another dimensional realm, it's been decided that our spirit will come to Earth, find its human suit, then, what's that process? So at some point, our mothers become pregnant. And when our mothers become pregnant, she basically starts gestating and creating a human fetus inside her body that will develop over 9 months as it forms a skeletal system and a circulatory system and a nervous system. And then 9 months, when it's ready to come out of the womb, 9 months later, the doctor then delivers the baby into the open world where it will become sentient. But there's a process there first. When he holds the baby upside down to clear its airway of amniotic fluid, gives a little spank on the bottom. And I ask people on my tour, and that causes the baby to do what? Most people say cry. And it definitely does that. But there's one thing that has to happen first before that baby cries, which is take its first breath. And so in the ancient and modern worlds, there are many words that mean both breath and spirit at the same time. Prana actually is one of those words. But when that baby takes its first breath, possibly, maybe, the way it works is that the spirit has been hovering outside, maybe around the mother, waiting for that baby to come out, so that when it does take its first breath, spirit goes in. And that's where we literally get the word inspire, spirit going in. So the baby takes its breath and spirit goes in, but one thing we notice is the spirit, if it's fourth dimensional and the baby's body's 3-dimensional, it doesn't pass through, it stops there. Somehow it stops in that same time and space because it's got to put the suit on and it's got to stay in it in order for the suit to be able to carry it around, the meat suit, that's where the word incarnate comes from. So, it's got to stay there. But how does it do that? Well, when I asked that question, it took a while for it to develop, but then I came into information or, recalled information about the pineal gland being referred to as the seat of the soul. And so I got to thinking about that. I did more research on it. There's all these amazing things about the pineal gland, but it seems to be a, very important topic of interest when it comes to spirit and spirituality and stuff. So as the seat of the soul, I had started to kind of form the notion that it was the nexus point that connected our spirit to our body and keeps it in place throughout this life. And so now that baby's got its human suit. As a matter of fact, it's got several things that it needs. And I'm going to show you in this diagram. In order to be a whole human being, which means its body and its mind and its spirit. That's the complete triangle. So now it has that. The body is obvious. The mind would be the connection to the pituitary gland, and the spirit is the entity that comes into this time and space and occupies it and hopefully guides it through this life, but in any case gets carried through it. So, but that baby has to, now get to the end of its life. And that can come sooner or later, hopefully later, when after a nice, successful, happy life. But anywhere in between, accident, injury, illness, disease, whatever, can cause our lives to end prematurely, but they will end, and that's the one guarantee we have. I never met an immortal human. So, that end comes. And when it does, we will take our last breath. We will inhale one last time, and we'll exhale. And when our body is no longer viable and can no longer sustain the presence of a spirit within it, perhaps that spirit leaves with our last breath, and perhaps that is where we get the word expire, spirit exiting. I'm just saying. So these things tend to kind of match up. But see, while we're alive, we have to continue to breathe. There's 3 things that are critical: food, water, and breath. Cut somebody's food off, they die in weeks. Cut their water off, they die maybe in days. Cut their air off, and you got maybe minutes. So air and breath is the most critical thing to keep us here in the most immediate sense. And it's really funny because this kind of came to me on a tour one time. But those are the three things we need to sustain our life, just on a basic root level. But they're also the three things that can kill us. We can eat the wrong things and bring about a premature death. We can definitely drink the wrong things. Going back to eating, we can eat the wrong things or eat too much. We can drink the wrong things and bring about a premature death. When it comes to breath, we can smoke things and pollute ourselves, maybe even accidentally, industrial accident or something. But those things that can heal us and sustain our life are also avenues and things to toxify ourselves and end our lives. So it's good to keep that in mind if you want to be, a happy, healthy, enlightened, evolved person, which I'm not saying I am, but it's pretty obvious that that's part of the formula there. So, the more I do this, like I said, it helps me. Hopefully, the more I realize it, integrate it, and can express that and live it, So, but the end of our life will come. We'll take our last breath. Spirit will likely exit when we take our last breath. And our body remains behind, but the spirit just kind of goes into the next thing. And that's how I started leading people to the point or the suggestion or the idea that the prana are a fourth dimensional phenomenon, as is our spirit. Because while that spirit's in our body, it could be that we come back to, in the fourth dimensional sense, laws that mean that maybe two fourth dimensional objects can't occupy the same space at the same time either, similar to the way they can't in the physical world, the third dimension. So when I saw the prana bouncing, off my hand and in between my fingers and all that, I had to find a way to explain that. It's like I can show it to people. Matter of fact, I can show it to everybody. Everybody that comes on my tour sees this, except people that have really bad eye problems like glaucoma or recent surgeries. And there's a few examples, but I've shown this to thousands of people, and they all have the same experience. Not everybody takes it the same way. Most people take it as a very deep kind of spiritual revelation. Other people are just like, okay, whatever, Where's the wine? They want to drink, so, all right, we move on and get them to their alcohol if that's what their priority is, which, fine, cool, you're paying for it. So. But what I actually want, what my hope is when people do this tour is that they have these revelations and these experiences, and they get to walk away with a deeper understanding of their life and their spirit and their world, and how all this kind of fits into place, how it all kind of works together. So while we're here, and like I said, we have to continue to breathe to keep our bodies sustainable and viable for the spirit to stay in place. We call that respiration or respiration. So I don't remember if I covered this. When we take our last breath, we expire. And spirit leaves or exits with that last exhale. But while we're here, we have to continue to breathe. So we respire, or we call that respiration, but it's really respiration. So respiriting. Every time you take that breath, you're recycling your spirit and your vitality and your, life force through you. And so just showing you how it's encoded and built into our language that breath and spirit are the same thing. I'm not saying it is, but that's what it appears to be telling us. And there's one more. So when I have a group of people out, doing a Vortex tour, and we're doing the Prana thing, and I get into this explanation, I say, that the fact that we're all sitting here with a common focus and a common purpose, as we breathe together during our, breathing exercise or warm up, that what we're actually doing is conspiring, which is where the word conspiracy comes from, which means to breathe together. I then suggest a criminal conspiracy, if we want to, knock off a bank or something like that. That's just a joke I tell, but anyway. But again, all these words are in alignment with this idea that breath and spirit are the same thing. And so, it's in us, it appears to be. So again, going back, we got the second dimension, which I call the world of shadow or reflection. The third dimension, which I call the realm of body or the world, the physical world we live in. And then the fourth dimension, which is the realm of spirit. You can see those diagrammed here. So now this is where, people have seen the prana. They've seen it bounce between their fingers. They've seen it, roll around in their hand. But this is where I start to kind of get into concepts about, how we apply this. And that's a good question because, okay, you brought us out here. It's hot, sweaty, or it's cold, or it's, sleet, hail, whatever. We don't do it in the rain, but every other type of weather we do this in. What does it all mean? Where does the rubber hit the road? Okay. Well, that's a good question. So, but I have an answer. As soon as I take another sip of Brain Boost here. I'm going to introduce you. I want you to kind of experiment with this if you care to try. Go find a light source and hold your hand into it in a place where you might see your hand cast a shadow on the ground or the wall. Okay? Try to make it as clear as you can. Or go into maybe the bathroom where you have a mirror. Hold your hand up again to the mirror, not against it, but away from it. And what I want you to do is move your hand. And when you move your hand, you'll notice your shadow or your reflection moves as well. And that's a very mundane thing that we've seen our whole lives. We take a walk down the sidewalk. It's a sunny day. We see our shadow. Our shadow moves with us. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is in the context. So, again, you've seen this your whole life. It's always been there, so it's not, you don't really think of it as any kind of like a phenomenon. But I want you to think about it that way for once, or for the first time. And understand that when you move your hand and your shadow or your reflection moves as well, that you just used the third dimension to create an outcome on the second dimension. So in this example, I'm in my studio. I'm in front of my camera or my phone, and you're seeing me hold up my hand, which is a two-dimensional experience for you. But for me, I'm here and this is my hand. So when I look into the monitor, I move my hand and I'm seeing the image of my hand move or the reflection. Okay. So I'm using the third dimension to create an outcome on the second dimension. Okay. So we have to remember that the pineal gland may be let's just consider it where every thought, emotion, and experience occurs. Okay. So before I moved my hand to make my shadow or reflection change, I asked people, what did I have to do first? Some people get it right away. Sometimes I have to kind of steer them into it, but the answer is I had to think about it. Okay? The thought had to happen first. Move your hand, and then I moved my hand and my shadow and reflection change. Okay? Now, where does that come from? So I'll tell you a story. I had a tour a long time ago, an amazing woman. I don't want to give her name, but she was kind of found on the internet, but her nickname was Rocket. And Rocket was really fascinated by all this. And we did a 3-hour tour. We just sat at the Vortex and we talked about this and demonstrated it for 3 hours. And especially getting to the whole, dimensional aspect of it and the, multidimensional universe. But she was a rocket scientist. Her and her husband were both NASA engineers and helped develop the space shuttle program. So, pretty amazing person. They built experimental aircraft and, all kinds of cool stuff together. So, and, I have an aerospace background. So her and I had a lot in common. We, loved airplanes and, she told me about her aviation background and all that. So it was a very fascinating tour. But, she asked me, so what about the first dimension? I said, well, that's a really great question. Now, at this time, I wasn't diagramming this the way that I am now on my tours. But what I did was I looked on the ground, I found a rock, and I handed it to her. And I said, Rocket, why don't you show me, what you think the first dimension is? I didn't tell her what to do. I knew what she was going to do. But I handed her to the rock, and she took the rock, and she goes, okay, well, it's pretty easy. And she, went down on the, rock we were kind of sitting on, and she just scratched a straight line into it, as you'll see here in this diagram. So I said, okay, is that your first dimension? She goes, yeah. I said, okay. Now, I know she's an engineer, a really smart, brilliant woman, and she was going to get this right away, but I had to walk her through it because it was time for me to explain it to myself as well. So I said, I see how your line represents the dimension of length. Okay. And she goes, yeah. And I said, but if we examine this, that line has a very small width to it. Maybe like even 0.2 of an inch. But we can see it. Yeah. Okay, cool. And the rock you used to draw that line left residue. Because, there it is. We have to measure it on a micron level, but it's there. And, we can understand that. And she goes, yeah, okay. And she sees where I'm going. So I said, now, if we take those other 2 dimensions away, we probably would not even see the line representing length, would we? And she goes, no. I said, right. And then I said, here, let me ask you this. I said, Rocket, what can you see that you cannot measure? And that's when I got a little proud because I stumped a rocket scientist, Anyway, she said, let me think about it. And I said, you just said it. And then I said, this is where I came up with the example of imagine a beach ball in your mind. You don't need to close your eyes. Just imagine a beach ball. And so I usually do this with a larger group, but in this case it was just her. But usually everybody will imagine a beach ball, and they say, yeah, they'll acknowledge that. I say, now you can see it in your mind, right? Yeah. And then if I hand you a tape measure or a ruler, or some kind of measuring device, will you be able to measure that for me? No. Okay. But you can see it. So it's objective. Because you can see it in your mind, but you can't measure it. Because there's no dimensions there to be measured. So that's what I said. That is probably the first dimension. And I call that the realm of thought. Boom. What we can see in our mind doesn't exist, but we can see it. That is why the first dimension to me is the realm of thought, but it is also the zero dimension, as is represented here. Now you'll notice I drew the 0 around the 1 because it represents the same dimensional realm. But we also find that as an archetype or symbol whenever we see the power button on our computer, which is this. And that is where it comes from. The notion that 1 and 0 are the same thing. They're integrated. On, off, same thing. So stew on that for a second. Because, like I said, backing up, before I moved my hand to change my shadow, I had to think about it. And there's nothing there except an idea floating around in the ether. Hey, dummy, move your hand. And I move my hand. And all of a sudden there's an outcome on the second dimension. Instant feedback. Yep. Okay, cool. Does that mean anything? Yes and no. It's not. To somebody that doesn't have a lot of depth or interest in this, it's not going to mean much. But to people that do, be ready because we're going somewhere else now. What if, instead of creating the outcome on the second dimension, I wanted to create the outcome in the third dimension? In other words, in my body, on my body, or in my world. If I wanted to create the outcome to shape my reality and my world where I live in this body. And, and this is where I get into Sister Cleo issues. The telephone psychic that went to federal prison for fraud and 976 numbers and all that. Well, she may have been a criminal, but when I think about her, it helps me establish that, there are 3 major umbrella issues that people want to resolve. And there's a lot of little smaller issues underneath that. But it usually, when people called her, it was almost always about something regarding love, money, or health. Okay? So I use the example, Sister Cleo, and I say, maybe with regard to money, I need a job or a raise. I need to manifest that. Maybe with regard to health, I have a health issue, or a loved one has a health issue. And I would like to see them resolve that, or, heal, or myself. And maybe with regard to love, I have a broken relationship. Maybe it's salvageable. Maybe not. But, if it is, I would like to, recruit the power of this great spirit and the universe and all that, blah, 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 to help me resolve this or fix it or find a way to move on, So again, going back to the pineal gland being the center, at the center of our brain, perhaps maybe being the place where all thought, emotion, and experience happen, maybe also being the nexus point between our physical body and our spirit being that aspect of us that is closer to the Creator. I need to figure out how, instead of, thinking before I move my hand to move my reflection or my shadow to somehow recruit that part of my mind to get it to move my spirit to create an outcome on the third dimension. So here's my diagrams to represent that, okay? So in simple terms, move the body, move the shadow. Move the spirit, move the body. Okay? So what I'm saying is that it's possible, maybe likely, according to my experience here, that when we want to create an outcome on one-dimensional plane, we go to the one before, or the higher one. Let me put it that way. So to create an outcome on 2, we go to 3. To create an outcome on 3, we go to 4. And notice how we're right in the middle, in between those two. So they're the ones we have direct access to. But to move the spirit to help create an outcome on the third dimension or in the physical world, instead of a simple thought to move my hand, to move my shadow, I have a more complex thought. Because remember, we get exponentially more complex from the lower dimensions to the higher dimensions. So I pray and I meditate. A little more involved than just, hey, I want to move my hand, okay? So when we pray, and I don't care who you pray to, God, Buddha, Allah, Great Pumpkin. That's why I try to keep this religion neutral, because everybody's got different ideas and different deities, whatever. Go with it. Maybe this is the mechanism for how this works, but we pray, which means to sincerely ask. With my whole mind and my whole heart, my whole body, I'm asking, I need this outcome. And it could be love, money, health, or something else, And so we pray and we send it up. But then we meditate. And that's our opportunity to listen. First we ask, then we listen. Now by listen, I don't mean that we just sit there for 20 minutes and try to go quiet and try to hear something. The purpose of meditation is to raise our sensitivity and our awareness and invoke and cultivate stillness and quiet, so that when we come out of our meditation, it changes us a little bit and we walk through the world a little bit of a different person than we were before, and we grow through that. But it doesn't mean that you have to wear an orange robe, shave your head, and walk barefoot. You can be who you are, wear the same clothes, have the same friends, have the same job, do whatever you do as you go through this life being you. But you've attuned yourself a little bit more to listen for that answer when it comes. Sometimes the answer comes as a very loud bang. And we can't miss it. It's like, God, you'd have to be blind and deaf to, not see this. Other times it's very subtle. It's like a little whisper in your ear. It's like, hey. But we want to be able to hear it when it does come. And the more attuned and the more aware and the more sensitive you are, the more subtle that answer can be, and you're going to snatch it right out of the air. And that is a pun that is very relevant to what I'm going to share with you coming up, because I've made this happen. So, very funny story coming up about that, actually. Funny and sad and touching at the same time. But, you do that, and then all of a sudden, one day the phone rings, and you pick it up. Hello. Hey, is this so-and-so? Yeah, okay. Well, we want to tell you that you got that job. You've been hired. Or, hey, we've considered your application for a raise or promotion. We're going to grant that to you. So you manifested a miracle there. Or you get another phone call, and it's your doctor's office, and they say, hey, your lab results are clear, or your imaging scan is clear. Something like that. Or, maybe you got a tumor that's shrinking now. Cancer maybe going into remission or something, So you asked and the universe answered. And there's, countless number of ways these things can manifest. Most of us have experienced it in some form. Not everyone. Well, I don't know about most, but many have. Or, you run into your ex-girlfriend and you think maybe, this is the moment where I can say, hey, let's fix this. And, she's just not in the same spot. And you don't get to fix it. And you both move on, go your separate ways. And sometimes I make that as a joke on my tours. But the point is that the answer can be, and maybe even often, depending on what we're asking for and where we stand with it, the answer can be no. And that no can save us. Because what we want, what our heart maybe desires, what our body is craving, or whatever, is the poison that could derail us and wreck us. Believe me, I know that story. So when the universe says no, just the more you can learn to just go with that and accept that, the better off you're going to be. Better opportunities may be coming up around the corner, down the road, who knows. But take that no and don't let it drive you crazy. Don't go obsessed or obsessive about, trying to reject that answer. Because that could really lead you to trouble, And just accept it as the universe talking to you that this is not for you. This is not where you're supposed to. This is not the direction you're supposed to go. Go another direction. And then ask for that. What is the direction? You'll probably get an answer to that too. So, but the point is, that's your power. And I believe these are the keys to what people want when they say enlightenment, is understanding that you are a product and a being that is in the physical world, in the physical universe. And your best chance at influencing this is going to be somewhere outside of it. Going to the metaphysical places and appealing to that power. Now, I've covered first dimension, second dimension, third dimension, fourth dimension. Again, going higher, we get more exponentially complex. Now, the fifth dimension, which you see in the diagram here, is what I call the realm of the creator. Now, when I say creator, I don't necessarily mean the God of Jehovah or Abraham or the Christian God. Maybe not. But whoever you regard as the higher power in the universe that oversees all this. It could be just the universe itself or cosmic energy or, whatever. Whatever, you regard as that higher power, I believe resides in that fifth dimensional realm. So when we want to pray and ask for something and then we meditate for it, we're recruiting that spiritual part of us because it's right next door to where the Creator lives. And the Spirit is that interface. You notice how in the third dimension, we're separated by one whole other dimensional realm from the fifth dimension. We can't access it directly as physical beings. And that's where I think the saying comes from that you can't look God straight in the face. And that's why God is often represented as, powerful bright light or the sun, because you can't stare at the sun, and bright light is just, too much for us to handle. So there has to be kind of that layer between. And that's what I believe one of the purposes of the fourth dimension. So that fourth dimensional aspect of us is the one that, actually transmits that prayer and that meditation to the Creator. And then the Creator considers it. That's the power that is going to say yes or no. Again, positive, negative, 1, 0. I'm not sure how that relates, but it just came to me. So, but that's where that answer comes from. So, may I please, yes, no. And we all have these things. Now, we're kind of at the end of the diagram here. But I want to kind of condense it down a little bit. All these dimensional realms are aspects of us as individuals. And they all exist in the same time and in the same space. So going down the line by the numbers, 1, the realm of thought. We have a mind and we have thoughts. Those are part of us. The one-dimensional aspect of us. We have a shadow and we cast a reflection, and wherever we go, that's where it is. And so that's the second dimensional aspect of us. And we obviously have a body that's self-explanatory. This is my vehicle, and again, we're here in the middle, and metaphorically speaking, we look one way, we see the world of shadow in the second dimension, the world of reflection, all that. And so, one of the arguments I make is to see the fourth dimension, we look metaphorically the other way. And, maybe we just see the outer fringe of the fourth dimension, and maybe that's what the prana is. And I don't know. I can't prove any of this, but I'm just thinking. It's all based on abstract reasoning, so I get that. But third dimension, body or physical world where we live. Fourth dimension, well, if we have a spirit, it's in us. So that's another dimensional aspect of ourselves. And then we have the power to create that is inherent to us and kind of built in. So, when it comes to children, that's mostly the mom, but the dad's involved too. Certainly ain't going to happen without the male part of it. But the mother gestates and forms and manufactures this human body inside of her own. So we are creators. We have an aspect of the creative power in us, and so that's our fifth dimensional aspect. Or whoever, male, female, goes out and builds something. Well, that's creative. You took so you're building a house or, dining table. You go out and find some wood, right? And say, wow, I could make a table out of that. So through your efforts and your ideas, and you build a table. Boom, you created it. So in a manner of saying, you didn't create the material, obviously. Well, maybe in some way you did. Maybe you grew the trees that produced the wood to build the table. Anyway, you have a hand in it. You have an aspect to yourself that is creative and has creative potential and can create things, including humans, new humans. So you have all these multidimensional aspects built into you that exist in the same time and in the same place. It's all right here. And look at you, look at yourself, look at, where you're sitting, where you're standing. And that's why I tell people when I usually start the vortex part is one of the things I say is when we look out, when our eyes are open, we see the world, we see everybody in it, we see the things in it and everything. When we close our eyes, we start to look inward, we start to see the universe and ourselves, our place in the universe and who we are. And the, some stillness in there where new things kind of come in. But, when you're open, you're out. When you're closed, you're in, So all these things, instead of in a line like I'm showing you here in this diagram, I want you to notice above where I have a bunch of concentric rings that represent by color the dimensional realms that I've just kind of explained in great detail here. But take them one by one and imagine them kind of as overlays with each other. They're all kind of meshed together. Again, existing in the same time, in the same space, but different dimensions. So, they may or may not recognize each other in some kind of physical sense where, I don't know if the first dimension sees the second dimension or vice versa or so on. I don't know. But just imagine all these things existing in the same time, in the same space. And that's who you are. Those are the elements that make you. And so when we leave here, we take our last breath, we expire, and maybe we just revert back to being purely spiritual beings. But notice how we shift from the physical world to the spiritual world. And that's where maybe the sum total of our experience exists now. And now instead of being between the second and fourth dimension, now we're between the third and fifth dimension. So this is where my great story, or one of them, comes into play. For anybody that's seen the movie Interstellar, there's an interesting scene in there where, they're on a mission to save humanity. They launch a starship. They go through the wormhole. Mission failure, catastrophic failure. And it's like, scrub the mission. It's like, what are we going to do? So the two survivors, Matthew McConaughey, Anne Hathaway, I don't know their names or their characters in the movie, but they're like, okay, well, we've got a wrecked ship and we got to find the other planet where we can survive. So let's go there. And they're going to slingshot around Gargantua, the big black hole, or what's the physics name for it? I forget. And so they're in the ship and they're using it for power. He's in one, she's in the other, and they're attached to the main central ship. And as they're starting to slingshot around the black hole, Matthew McConaughey says, well, I'm going to cut you loose now. I'm going to go into the black hole and just kind of see what happens. And she's like, oh, no. So she's kind of freaking out. But, she's being sped off into another part of the universe to go find this other planet. He goes into the black hole. But as he's falling into it, all of a sudden, everything kind of strips away. There's no more ship. There's just him falling into a black space. And then all of a sudden, the black space starts to open up into this complex of, tunnels and passageways. And he doesn't know where he's at. And he's kind of freaking out. He loses his robot too, but he's still communicating. This supercomputer robot, TARS, I think. And so as he's falling into this space, all of a sudden he starts realizing that he's passing by all these different compartments that represent different scenes with him and his daughter in her bedroom where the family library exists. And, a lot of it is flashbacks to conversations they had before he left Earth. Trying to explain to her, it's like, I got to go do this to save humanity. And she doesn't want him to leave. And, she's kind of sad and freaking out. But up to that point, throughout the movie, she's been kind of commenting or complaining that, there's a ghost in her bedroom knocking books off the shelf. And, and then they figure out that there's some kind of anomaly going on here and they're not really sure the nature of it. But anyways, he ends up going into this space and he's seeing her and all these different relevant time
If you're leaving, just go.
slot, time spaces, Well, this is complicated to explain.
Don't go!
So it turns out that in the screenplay and the script and the director's notes, that space that he ends up inside of as he's moving through and seeing his daughter at different times is called a tesseract. And a tesseract is a fourth dimensional realm. So the spiritual realm. But in this case, you kind of see or get the notion that time is being represented as a physical dimension, because it's theorized, or it's theoretical, that a fourth dimensional being, if we could see one existing in our world in the third dimension, that would be a super being with superpowers that could move through time and space, up, down, left, right, back, forth at will, and actually see moments in time that it could, reach into and peel down to its infinitely small layers and change something and then put it back and then walk away. Walk on water, walk through walls, look inside of a rock, see a chunk of gold, reach in, pull the gold out, hand it to you.
Every moment.
Look at a sick person, reach inside them, perfectly remove a tumor from the sick person, throw it away. That's theoretically what a fourth dimensional being could do in our world. So the reverse of that is a physical being in the fourth dimensional world. And so that's what he is in the tesseract. And now his daughter is back on Earth at a different time, billions of light years away, and he's got to get a message to her. And it's like, oh. So when he starts to figure out where he's at, his fear starts to kind of dissolve, and his robot's kind of helping him figure this out. But it's like, oh, I get it now. All right, well, now he's got to find her at the exact right moment, at the exact right time, in the exact right space. And then the question is, how do I do that? Now it's kind of cringy and cheesy, but, all of a sudden, love, so in other words, follow your heart. And so he starts following his heart, or he comes to that realization, and then all of a sudden, he starts flying right to the exact spot where he's supposed to go, and he sees her from the backside of the bookcase, which is a quantum realm from the tesseract. He's not physically there, but he sees her, and he's banging on the books, and all of a sudden she starts to realize that the ghost is Dad. But let's look at that for a second. What is a ghost? Well, it's a disembodied, possibly fourth dimensional entity. So she realizes that the ghost is actually Dad, and he's trying to communicate to her, but he's taken, his power, and he's used it to encode a watch that he gave her before he left Earth that's sitting on the bookcase or a shelf. And he encodes the second hand needle to do like a Morse code that ends up giving her a formula which she's able to take back to NASA and overcome the problem of gravity to get a giant spaceship off Earth and save humanity. So I didn't write it, but that's the story. But anyway, it kind of illustrates that point, So I say that to bring you to this real world example that happened on my tour, and it was a miraculous event, and it was incredible, and it was just mind-blowing for all of us that were there. But in the example I just gave you from Interstellar, he's essentially reaching across a quantum threshold from the fourth dimension to communicate to his daughter in the third dimension. And remember what I said earlier, when we want to affect an outcome in one dimension, we go to the next higher dimension. At least that's what I've resolved for so far. So that's what he's doing in this movie. But several months ago, maybe getting close to a year now, I booked a tour for 3 young ladies. They were in their late 20s, early 30s. They were all from San Diego. And they wanted to book a tour. 99+% of my guests are women. Pardon me. And I think I may have mentioned in my previous video that it's like I'm a strange guy. I show up to pick them up. I certainly don't look like Brad Pitt or anything like that, when he was younger. But anyways, I have to, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, girls get in the car and they're just like, okay, who are we with? And I have to kind of, show them my sense of humor and my good side, and try to convince them that I'm not going to take them off in the middle of the desert and do bad things, so, it just happens. And usually, I'm able to overcome that pretty easily. People get to know me and they realize I'm not a, psychopath or a serial killer or anything like that. So they get in the car and they wanted to just do a 3-hour straight Vortex tour. So, where I picked them up was pretty close to the first Vortex that, I wanted to go to, which was the airport Vortex. So I didn't have a lot of time to really warm up to them or get them to warm up to me. We just kind of drove straight there. Did a little bit of a scenic tour on the way, but, we got there relatively quickly. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm kind of explaining my approach to the whole Vortex and the Prana viewing and all this, and believe me, after this experience, things really, really changed, for me and my tours, and hit another kind of acceleration point or, revelation. But now I'll tell you before I continue, though, there was a tour months before this one that inspired me to start documenting these experiences as they unfold. As soon as I recognize it, start documenting it somehow. And I'll tell you about that one later. But in this case, I picked these girls up. We got to the airport parking area, airport Vortex parking area. And I parked there and I said, okay, just follow me. And I'm leading them up a hill and down a trail. And so we get to the trail before it starts to descend down into a ravine. And down in that area of the ravine is where I was told that the Vortex is located. So I just said, okay, so, as we're going up the trail, I'm leading them to this point, but we get to the top of the trail before our descent. And I said, oh, wow, there's a rock cairn there, which is a stack of rocks and a cage. It's got a signpost in it, pointing different directions, saying different things. But there was a prickly pear cactus right next to it. And I said, wow, check that out. Here's a prickly pear that's perfectly shaped like a heart. And, it's unusual to see one that grows that way naturally, which this one was. But sometimes people take a pocket knife and they'll cut a V in the top of the leaf to make it heart-shaped. That will usually kill the plant at some point because you break the skin and that protective layer is, now exposed, and disease and insects and things can get in there and start killing it. So, but this one, the skin was intact, so it grew naturally that way, which, it's kind of not quite like finding a 4-leaf clover, but kind of a little like that. But I said, wow, perfectly heart-shaped. Here's the picture of it, So they were like, oh, wow, that's really cool. And they got their pictures. I got mine. Here's mine. And, we checked it out. And we're kind of excited about it for 2 minutes. And then we continued. So we got to the top of the ravine. And I said, okay, now look, down there is where the Vortex is supposed to be. and where I shot the video on my homepage with the girls, oh, got another powerful experience. Whew, wow, get into that too. But anyway, I said, now you can go down there by yourselves, or I can go down there with you. What do you prefer? And they said, well, we'll go on our own. And like I said, they didn't quite know me that well by then, but they were kind of warming up a little bit, So anyways, they decided to go down on their own. I said, cool, I'll sit up here. So there's like a big flat red rock bench rock, kind of there at the top of the ravine. So I just sat there quietly. They went down there. And now here's the thing. What they had told me, I kind of skipped over. These 3 girls from San Diego were part of a group of 4 girls who all grew up together as, from toddlers to elementary school, to middle school, to high school, to college, and to work. And they all worked in the same company. And they were like, they weren't related, but they were like sisters, and they all took their vacations together, and they traveled around the world. They went to exotic places like, Bali and Jamaica, and then, different places. And they were kind of telling me about this, but they were really, really bonded. I mean, they grew up together and they knew each other, and they were tight sisters, So the 4th one, whose name was Betty, died recently at an early age from cancer. This trip and this tour was all about commemorating Betty. And I was so glad they told me that, because with that understanding, they gave me a premise from which to focus the whole Vortex experience. Now, I hadn't done that directly at this point, and they were down there in the ravine between 2 red rock hills, and they were there for maybe 20 minutes. So they came up to where I was, and I said, but while they were still down there, I want to cover this. I decided at that moment to consciously invoke the power, the power of this multidimensional experience that I have diagrammed for you and explained to you. So I went inward as they were down there. I closed my eyes and I just said, I don't necessarily say the word God, but, Creator, Great Spirit, please use me as a vehicle for facilitating a great experience for these girls regarding their friend Betty. I can't remember exactly how I worded it, but it was something to that effect. And then I just let it go. And I kept my eye on them, and I kind of looked out to the view, from there. And then all of a sudden they were done. They were heading back up, and they came up to where I was sitting on that big flat red rock bench rock. And I said, why don't you join me here for a minute? I said, well, just sit down and get comfortable and let's just talk, So they sat down. We're all just kind of right there in a little group, And I started asking questions about Betty. I said, what kind of person was she? Tell me about her. What'd she look like? What was her favorite color? Just kind of get to know you kind of thing. So as they were talking, I'm kind of taking it in. And then I said, so what was Betty's favorite thing to do? And as soon as one girl closest to me started to answer, where we were was right at the base of Airport Mesa, where the Sedona Municipal Airport is, and planes take off all the time. But as soon as she started to answer my question, a plane, a little single engine, loud ass Cessna, took off right over our head and just completely drowned her out so that I couldn't hear what she was saying. And so it passed. I gave it a second, and I said, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your answer, but, what was Betty's favorite thing to do? And she said, oh, well, Betty really loved airplanes. Okay. And she loved flying and she loved going places. And whenever we were going to go on vacation, she got really excited about going to the airport and, stuff like that. And I said, so you say she really loved airplanes. I mean, that was her favorite aspect of traveling, Because every time she went to the airport and got on a plane, that's when she got really excited. And I know the feeling because that's exactly me, you know. But I pointed up at the sky because the plane just went over. And all of a sudden the girl was like, I mean, you could see this rapid change just kind of wash over her. And her whole energy just was like, oh my God, you know. And I'm like, what? I didn't know what was going on at the moment. But she looked at her friends and she goes, and they were listening to this. I mean, they were right there. They were paying attention. And she said, should we show him? She didn't say what it was. They all knew. They were all wearing these long black yoga pants. I think they call leggings. And they looked at each other and they were like, yeah, let's show him. And they all reached down at the same time. They pulled up the ankle on their yoga pants. And all three of them showed me this tattoo. Now, I share that story on my tours because I'm sincere about this, and there's something to it, something extremely, probably the most powerful thing ever. But I like to at least give a real world example of how we manifest. You know, using the third dimension to create an outcome on the second, but I think more importantly, to use the fourth dimension or spiritual dimension to create an outcome in our physical world. They all started crying, and that touches my heart and my soul. Like, you know, I just can't even describe. And I tell this story to other people and they start crying sometimes, not always, but I do get criers on my tours, and it gets me kind of choked up sometimes too. But they were kind of speechless. And I told them, I said, I can't help but get the overwhelming sense that Betty is among us right now. Somehow. Speaking to us and reaching across the threshold from where she's at in the Tesseract, in the fourth dimension, in the spiritual realm, to communicate to us that she's here and that she's listening and that she's paying attention and she's with us. And unless you've ever had that happen to you, I can't describe to you how all of a sudden you start to feel that you have found your purpose in life. And so that's what I'm here to do, more than anything. And I pray all the time that, you know, I can do more of this, that I will be used in that way to facilitate more experiences like this. Because I'll tell you, if you're that kind of person, there's nothing more satisfying. Nothing. And, you know, at this point in my life, you know, the more I can be used, you know, for that, then the better. So anyway, there it is, folks. This video went on far longer than I had intended to, and is definitely by far the longest video I've ever made. You know, like 2.5 hours. So, but I tried to pack it with a lot of information. I know this is not going to be for a huge, broad audience. The people that are going to be drawn to this or end up watching it and taking an interest are probably going to be a more narrow segment of the overall audience, and that's okay. But for anybody that's interested in like coming on my tours or, you know, visiting my website, this is kind of an example of not necessarily what you could expect on a tour, but something that maybe could happen, especially if I'm given a premise from which to, you know, work with in the beginning. So It helps me kind of keep my eyes out and keep my ear to the ground, kind of, look out for anything that I need to pay attention to, and then I can kind of catch signals and clues, maybe develop that for people that want to come here with some kind of special situation that they want to celebrate or explore or find some resolution with. So, but my battery ran out when I was filming this before, so I have to come back into my studio and kind of film this ending and then paste it on so that it doesn't just come to an abrupt halt. But anyways, I want to express my sincere gratitude. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you got a lot out of it. There's lots more to come. There's lots more work to be done. I'm going to try to work with, keeping the length of the video, somewhere half hour, 40 minutes. And that's still really challenging a lot of people's attention span. But this is deep information. So, you got to make the investment if you want to get anything out of it. Anyway, but please check out my website, SedonaWineandVortexTours.com. You can learn more about our tour company. You can get a hold of us directly from there. Read our reviews, check our Google. It's all pretty good. And we work hard to build it, to keep it fun, enlightening, and entertaining for everyone that comes on. So, but whatever you want to do in Sedona, we can usually find a way to make it a lot more fun. So anyway, thanks again. Thanks for tuning in. Be safe and hope to see you. Thank you. Bye-bye.